Hello, my name's Marnie Ogg, and as always, I'm very grateful to have you join Dark Sky Conversations today. This conversation is an exciting one. It's covering the aspects of the impacts of light at night caused by satellite megaconstellations, such as those being launched by Elon Musk and other organisations around the world. You'll hear my guest Jessica Heim discuss her research in diverse ways these tens of thousands of satellites will make, not only on our night sky, but through the risk of increased space junk and clutter. Jessica's a resident in Missouri, but she feels close to Australia as she's a student at the University of Southern Queensland. I had the joy of meeting Jessica at a conference in Salt Lake City a few years ago and knew then that her zeal for dark skies would see her go far. It's really not surprising at all to see that this paper, in collaboration with John Barrentyne, another dark sky conversationist, has received a great deal of attention in the Australian media and abroad. And if you'd like to, you can read this on the website of the conversation piece or even by searching articles on the ABC News. But for now, enjoy our conversation together, me and Jessica Heim.
Hi, with a flick of a switch, we turn night to day and day to night. We can change seasons, actions and states of mind. Light is everywhere, used endlessly and very much a part of our modern world. But what is it? How do we use it? And how is it changing our environment and our behaviours? A star-filled sky used to be our evening's entertainment. Now it's Netflix, iPads or even a podcast. When was the last time you looked at the night sky? I'm Marnie Ogg, and this is Dark Sky Conversations, the podcast that brings people and science together to shed light.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us again. It's been a little while between Dark Sky Conversation podcasts, but I'm delighted to have a lady with me today, Jessica Heim from America. And in fact, Jessica, I'm just going to throw straight to you. Whereabouts are you speaking to me from today?
I'm in Minnesota.
Okay. Is that your hometown? Is that where you're based?
Minnesota. Yeah, I'm from Minnesota. So, yeah, it's like north central U.S. We're just south of Canada.
Okay. Yeah, I know where you are, right in the middle of the country, pretty much. So tell me, I've seen you describe yourself as a cultural astronomer, and I guess I'd just love to hear what that means, what drew you to it, and in fact, what drew you to dark skies at all?
Okay, let's see here. Do you want the abridged version or the full version?
No, you can tell me. Yeah, go for it. Tell me all of it.
Okay, once upon a time. Okay, so yeah, I was always really interested in the night sky growing up. My dad showed me a lot of the constellations, the Greek constellations, and so he'd take me out and look at the stars, and so I was aware of that from a young age. I liked reading books on outer space and, just about everything else, dinosaurs, anything outdoor nature, but I always thought space was cool. And then when I was in high school, my mom got me this really cool curriculum in my 12th grade year on astronomy. And I'm like, oh, this is super, super cool. I really, really like this. It's like kind of intro to astrophysics stuff. And I really liked it. And then with my college degree, I focused on music and environmental studies. So I double majored. And so I felt like everything was in my environmental studies except the sky. It was all the Earth stuff, but it was missing the top half.
Interesting. Yeah.
And then, several years after I graduated, I was just, trying to figure out, well, what did I want to do for a master's program? I looked at all these different programs. I'm like, oh, that's interesting, but I don't think I'll apply. That's interesting too. Not quite right. And so I was looking at classes at my local university. I thought, I'll just take a college class in some random thing that might be interesting. And there was a class offered on archaeoastronomy, and I read the class description, and it was like, oh, learn about, different cultures, different times in human history, and what people knew about the stars and how the stars were important in their lives. And I'm like, oh, that sounds really interesting. And so I emailed the professor. And she said, oh, well, if you don't really need the class for credit, don't take it now this summer online. Wait until the fall and you can take it in person in the planetarium. And I thought, oh, well, that sounds really cool. I'll take a class in a planetarium. And so that was Dr. Annette Lee. And she, that summer, it was the first summer she was offering the native sky watchers educator workshop program for K-12 teachers and how to, learn about Ojibwe and Dakota star knowledge and integrate it into their curriculum and things like that. And so I attended her workshop and I thought, oh, this is really, really interesting stuff. And I was talking to her at the end of the workshop and she's like, well, you should come and, volunteer at the planetarium. I'm like, well, what would I do if I volunteered at the planetarium? She's like, well, you can learn to operate the equipment and eventually, do your own shows. And I'm like, oh, that sounds really cool. And so I took that archaeoastronomy class that semester, and then, over time, and I was like TAing for the class, helping out with stuff and odds and ends, and started doing stuff at the planetarium, and I did shows there for quite a number of years. And one semester, she had a textbook for her class, and it was talking about, there was on the back cover, it said the author directed this master's program in cultural astronomy. And I'm like, oh, that sounds really interesting. And I asked her, oh, what do you think about this? And she's like, well, this summer I'm going out and I'm presenting some of my research at a conference they're hosting. I can find out some more about the program, while I'm there. And then I emailed them and asked some questions. I'm like, oh, this looks like a really good fit. This looks really interesting. And so that's how I enrolled in that master's program. And so, yeah, what cultural astronomy is basically just, as opposed to just your traditional Western astronomy, which just looks at the sky and we just study the stuff in the sky, completely devoid of humans. We just study that and that's it. The cultural astronomy connects that to humans. And so, how did different communities, cultures, star knowledge impact their navigation, their agricultural practices, their stories, culture, religion, all sorts of different aspects of that. And so cultural astronomy is very broad and interdisciplinary, and different people will study different aspects of it. So some people come at it from a traditional astronomy background. Some people have degrees in, say, history or anthropology or archaeology. And so it's very diverse. Archaeoastronomy typically is used a little bit more to refer to things you think of as like Stonehenge or like a particular site where, you have an alignment where the sunlight comes through on the summer solstice and lights up some particular part of the structures. What you typically think of, archaeoastronomy is broader than that, but usually it refers to more of like an archaeological site, but sometimes it's used interchangeably with cultural astronomy. And cultural astronomy is broader because it includes all those other perspectives as well, not just a physical site, but like the, what is the ethnography and the different cultural knowledge and that type of thing. So that's kind of how I got into the cultural astronomy. And as far as dark skies specifically, I was always aware of the concept of light pollution, I think even before I heard of the name, because when I was really little, my dad would talk about, oh, when we first moved here, there weren't any lights over there, and now you can see these lights, and it was totally dark before. And then, if the neighbors would put in some really bright light, he'd be like, they're putting in that stupid light, I can't see the stars, and So I was aware of the concept from a long time, but then when I was getting towards working on my dissertation during my master's program, and I was trying to figure out what exactly do I want to do for my in-depth research, that was about the time that the price on the LEDs went down, so they were being put in everywhere on all the street lights, and it was those super bright white lights. And I just noticed that my sky, which was always my stress reliever, no matter how stressed I was, I'd go outside and I'd look at the stars and I'd feel so much better. And then my stars were disappearing, and so it was just there was so much more sky glow. And then I'd go out to look at the stars and I'd get really angry about it. And so I thought, either I'm going to go up in a puff of smoke or I'm going to do something constructive. So then what I did for my dissertation was I was looking at, well, what's an example of people using LED street lights in a better way, looking at a lower color temperature and downward directed. And so I was going to different IDA conferences and trying to pick people's brains about, okay, so is there a really good example of this? I've seen all sorts of bad examples. Tell me about a good example. I want to study, a best case scenario. And I was looking at
how did that go?
Options. Yeah, it was interesting. I found a lot of, moderately bad options, but what I ended up doing was a study in Stanley, Idaho, where they had put in, it was a very small community, but they put in 2200 Kelvin street lights that were very minimal glare and all those type of things. And so I studied what they did as far as the technical aspect of the lights themselves, and then also, well, how did they actually implement this as a community? And I interviewed the mayor and various people in the community. So that's kind of how I got into dark skies in the more academic sense of it.
It's interesting. I always ask people how you get into dark skies, and there's usually a story there about, childhood past, going out and looking at the night sky, or even if it's not necessarily in their childhood, that a sense of recognizing the peace that the night sky gives people. I understand that you saying it was your stress reliever, because I know I would go out at my house when I was a child and look up at the stars, and I don't know, everything sort of just fell back into place and it was easier to deal with. So, yeah. But it sounds like, and this is partly why I've contacted you to speak today, because partly because of the buzz that was drawn by some research that you put out recently. It hit the Australian press about the satellite mega constellations and the work that you've been doing with regards to that. Now, I just wanted to go back a step. You were also studying with the University of Southern Queensland. Have you been out to Australia, or have you just been doing your research remotely?
I've been doing my research remotely thus far. At some point, I hope to come and visit, but thus far, I've been able to do things remotely. I just started last year, so.
I was going to ask you to compare the night skies, not northern and southern hemispheres, but we'll get you back on to do that. But yeah, as I was saying, the piece that's driven a lot of conversation recently is about this estimation of having 100,000 satellites in orbit by the end of this decade, and the impacts of that on our night sky. Do you want to give us a little bit of background on how that piece came together, and what was the impetus to start looking at this?
Yeah, so I guess, after I finished my cultural astronomy degree, I was starting to look a little bit more at the satellite constellation phenomenon, because before I was looking at ground-based stuff, like what we're doing on Earth that impacts the night sky, and I was really interested in, what's happening in the orbit around Earth, and how is that impacting how we see the night sky from Earth, and then also how is that impacting that environment itself. So kind of two aspects of that. And so, we've had satellites in orbit for decades. That's nothing new, but it's the sheer quantity and pace that is what is new. So, to give a sense of the scale, before the first Starlink satellites launched in May 2019, the estimate was there was about 2,200 active functional satellites. And then now, the most recent estimates I've looked at are about 7,600. And then, the estimates for how many will there be by the end of the decade, the most commonly cited number is 100,000. Sometimes people will say 400,000, and where those numbers come from, it's what have companies actually filed in their respective countries. And so there's one particular constellation that Rwanda had said that they're going to do that is, I can't remember the specific number, but somewhere in the realm of 400,000 satellites. And so then the astronomers look at those numbers and go, okay, well, what's actually going to, be launched? And so, we're thinking probably the 100,000 is probably the lower end of what's reasonable. I mean, it could be more. And of course, if there's something bizarre or catastrophic that happens, maybe it'll be less. But that's kind of the estimate of what we're thinking will probably happen. And what's different with these is just these are in low Earth orbit, so closer to Earth. And they're very large groups of constellations. The mega constellation refers to really big, so not just 50 or 100 satellites, but thousands or tens of thousands in a given company's.
And I guess we should mention the size of these satellites as well. They're not what we've known previously, are they?
Yeah, well, it depends on the specific satellite, because it gets really, you have, what we're talking about is, your bigger satellites. I think the rough estimate I've heard is they're the size of a car or a truck or a bus, that kind of range. I haven't seen one in person. As far as Starlink Generation 1, there are also a lot of, smaller things, little CubeSats going up, and those are tinier. But with the second generation that SpaceX plans to launch this year, those are projected to be substantially bigger with bigger mirrors. Then you also have things like Blue Walker 3, and they've only launched one object so far. But those are things you're talking about, the size of a huge room. And so there's concern about those as well, because they could be very likely extremely bright. So the concern is like twofold with the satellites. Is somewhat how bright an individual satellite is, and then also the sheer quantity of them is another part of the issue. And all those numbers, we're talking about things that are functional. There's tons of pieces of space debris out there, thousands, possibly millions of untrackable debris. When it's too small, we can't track it, and it's still dangerous. If it hits something, we just don't know where it is.
Well, there's that often cited incident with just a fleck of paint that had come off one of the, I think it's one of the space shuttles, wasn't it? Or did it go into the window of one of the space shuttles?
I think it went into the window of one of the shuttles, and it was, you can see how it cracked things.
And they went into full alert. They were really concerned about it, weren't they? They had to shut, protect, it was an emergency situation for the astronauts at the time. So, yeah. So you make the comment that it's going to be harder for astronomers to do their research, and actually I think the other part of this is due to the diffuse night sky brightness. So what does that mean exactly to, on a general lay understanding? What does that mean? What's diffuse night sky brightness, and how is it going to make it harder?
Yeah, so two aspects. So the one that most people probably think of with the satellites is just the concept of, okay, you look up at the sky and you see a bright object go by. And if you're an astrophotographer or a professional astronomer, then that thing goes through your field of view, and so you have this streak. So that's what has been talked about a lot is, these streaks. How do we make the satellites less bright so they are not streaking?
That's going to particularly impact the Vera Rubin telescope.
Yeah, because, there's a lot of aspects of astronomy that can be impacted, but like the concept of the streaks going through, with Vera Rubin is going to be very wide field and also long exposure time. So you combine that and you have the opportunity for a lot of stuff going through your field of view. So that's that aspect of it. But then what we were looking at specifically was the diffuse night sky brightness. And what that is it's the stuff that's up there on both intact satellites, and then to a larger degree, all the debris and stuff that's smaller, it all still reflects sunlight. And if it's smaller, dim, you might not be able to see it as an individual point source of light in the sky, but what it does is overall that stuff reflects, and it would make this dark sky less dark overall. And so we were looking at, for Vera Rubin specifically, well, how much, do we think that would impact Vera Rubin having that increase in the night sky brightness? And so what we had estimated was that, Vera Rubin would be able to resolve out some of those as individual point sources of satellites. So then you'd have, more streaks, but all the stuff that they couldn't resolve as the individual point sources, that would just make the sky brighter. And so that we figured would be about a 7.5% reduced efficiency, which would equate to approximately $22 million additional to do the same amount of science because of the lost efficiency.
I guess I always try and relate these to, everyday things. So, if you knew your car was running 7.5% less efficient, you had to put extra fuel in to make it work, we'd be doing something about it, wouldn't we? We'd be changing we'd feel it. We'd want to make a difference.
And the thing is, too, with that is those numbers are kind of conservative estimates, because the models were based on what was the rate of increase in numbers that were prior to 2019. We were not including the uptick that has happened since 2019. So if that continues to occur at the rate that it currently is, and if we have more collisions because the satellites are closer together, there's a greater odds that something could hit, or if we have more ASAT tests, anything that creates more debris, you will make it more pronounced than what our models suggested, because we were going on the conservative end. So it's kind of a baseline.
And I guess that would be an exponential growth. Yeah.
You're listening to Dark Sky Conversations with Marnie Ogg. We'll be right back after these messages from our sponsors.
Yeah, it's amazing. And you said we. Who did you collaborate with on this?
Yeah, so there's several of us. The lead author is John Barrentyne. And then Aparna Venkatesan, myself, James Lowenthal, and I'm not sure if I have their names pronounced quite properly because they're not English, but Miroslav Kosefed and Salvador Berra, and I probably messed up on their last name pronunciation slightly because I don't speak those languages. But
and we've actually had John interview on this podcast previously, well known for his work with the IDA and now doing his dark sky consultancy. And Miroslav, I understand, he's actually in the University of Southern Queensland, I think, isn't he? Yeah. His name is familiar to me.
I think so.
Anyway.
I work closely with John and Aparna and James because we're all on the American Astronomical Society's committee that's focused on space debris and light pollution issues. So we see each other all the time in our committee meetings.
Yeah. And well done on the work that you're doing, because this is really raising the awareness. You know, there's definitely people that ring in to radio stations and emails that we receive asking, you know, what are the bright streaks across the night sky? And there's a little bit of sense of fear around it, I think. You know, the natural reaction for people who maybe don't look at the night sky frequently is to think, oh, you know, it's an alien or a spaceship, or maybe it's a spacecraft, as you know, earthly spacecraft that's disintegrating or something. There've all been comments that I've seen. So in some ways, it's great that people are tuning into the night sky and seeing that there's a difference and a change. And then when we do explain to them that these are these are satellites that are being launched by the tens of thousands, basically, for the use of internet, satellite, GPS tracking systems, etc. And from what I've heard, also for gaming, people are a little bit shocked by it, you know, that even if they don't understand the full enormity of the situation, they are sort of shocked that we could be doing so much to our natural environment with, you know, no real understanding of what's going on, I think, or that it seems to be something that is unnecessary, or given we've got other ways of, you know, communicating with, you know, internet, etc. So it is an interesting one, and there are benefits to the Starlink and other constellations that are going up there that shouldn't be ignored. So I guess the question is, where do you think the future of this is going to go? Do you think,
Well, I guess
do you have a view of it?
Yeah, I guess my concern is just the nature of the business environment. I mean, it prioritizes, okay, well, you know, what, you know, an individual company can go, okay, well, what is in my best interest? What's good for my sustainability of my business from my perspective? And it's kind of the whole concern of the tragedy of the commons, where you have every individual actor who's like, okay, well, I'm going to do this. This is in your best good. And then you end up not having a very great resource availability, or like when you think of collapse of fisheries or things like that, you know, where a lot of people have access to something, and then, you know, you sometimes have problems. And so I think that there really isn't a lot of incentive to look at this over a much longer term time horizon. Like, I think that there's a lot of concern about space debris and space situational awareness in these industries. They're very cognizant of the fact that space debris is a problem, and it's, you know, you don't want to have an unsafe business environment. But I think it's so much of this, okay, well, you know, whoever gets there first gets XYZ orbital allocation. And, you know, you have the question of, well, what is, you know, an orbit's carrying capacity? You know, space is big, there's a lot of room, but it's not infinitely big. People used to think that, oh yeah, the ocean was really big, and we started realizing, oh wait, if you put enough garbage in it, it does start creating a problem after a while. And so, yeah, it's just, you know, looking at that long-term time horizon. And, you know, some people will say, well, you know, if we just have increased space situational awareness, then we can put things closer together. If we know where everything is and we can maneuver everything, well, then it will be safer to have things closer together. But you always have so many things that are unpredictable. Like, okay, if you have a hardware malfunction, then you can't control one of your satellites or more. Or let's say you have some really extreme space weather and your satellites get knocked out, or you can't communicate, or somebody hacks into the system and you can't control it. Or you have an ASAT test that creates a whole bunch more debris, and things can just get unpredictable very quickly. So it's very hard to come up with like a specific number on, okay, well, we're going to put XYZ number of satellites in a particular cell. And so then you'll have, well, this, you know, one orbit's getting, you know, a little bit fuller. So then another company will say, oh, well, we're going to be safer, so we're going to launch at a higher orbit. Well, then you have issues of, well, is this equitable in the long term? Is it whatever countries and businesses, have the money now can go fill up those orbits? So what about the people who come later? I think it's just currently it's not,
it's a bit of a race to the bottom, isn't it, at the moment?
Yeah. For many decades will create a problem at some point in time.
You brought up some really good different points. I mean, I do remember that one of the batches of Starlink that went up, I have a feeling they were actually not usable because there was a big auroral surge or magnetic surge, and so I think they just got wiped out.
Last year there were a number of them that, they didn't make it.
Yeah. And I think in one of the reports I was reading, it also mentioned the fact that, this could become a target for war as well. You could completely eradicate systems, etc. That if we're basing, if we're too, I mean, I guess it's the same with land-based things, but if we're too heavy reliant on it, then, it's an interesting tactic, I guess.
Yeah, there's a lot of different areas and issues and concerns that can intersect. And the thing about space is it's just, if you have an environmental disaster on Earth, it can be challenging to clean up, but like in space, it's even more challenging, and stuff's going so fast. So something that's intrinsically just an object, a little fleck of paint that isn't dangerous really, if it's flying around at thousands of miles an hour, it suddenly becomes a dangerous projectile, and it's just not, easy to just go, okay, well, we'll just vacuum up all the debris. Well, we don't even know where a lot of the smaller stuff is, and we can't track the super small things. So,
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about the space impacts of these mega constellations, but coming back to the cultural connection to the night sky, is there any connection there that you see is also being damaged, or any impacts to cultural connections?
Yeah, well, part of some of the conversations that are, going on between the satellite operators and the astronomers is focusing on, different mitigation. So one aspect is, okay, well, can you make the satellites less bright or make them glint less or things like that? And then there's also efforts that are being put into, well, how can we have software that will help, remove some of the impacts? It still will be impacts, but, from the research astronomers' perspective, are there things we can do that will help us revive some of our data? But the thing is, like, those type of things are not going to help for if you're just out there looking at the sky in real time, with the naked eye or with your backyard telescope or binoculars. You're going to see a lot of things. It will very much transform what the night sky looks like. And so, like the cultural aspects of that, like with, I was on the American Astronomical Society did the SatCon 2 workshop back in 2021, and we had a community engagement working group as part of that, and we had several people who were from different Indigenous communities, and they expressed a lot of concerns, and the concerns were multifold. I think one is obviously it's changing the sky, and so many of these cultures it's not like the sky is just this extra thing up there. It's very deeply ingrained. The above and the below are very much connected, and so it's seen as problematic to the ability to continue the traditions and the cultural knowledge if all of a sudden your sky is all changed up. And then another thing that was mentioned a lot as well is just the consultation aspect, because a lot of people that I've spoken to from those communities are like, okay, all these changes are being made and then we weren't consulted. And then a lot of times the PR about it is, okay, well, we're going to provide, these satellites will provide internet to the rural poor, and there's examples of places where people have benefited from that. But, is that really the best way to have development, as you come in and say, oh, guess what? I have this great thing for you to use. Or do you ask the community, so what do you want? How do you want to participate? I think it's kind of a continuation of a model that has been problematic in a lot of ways. And so there's a lot of people talking about how, there needs to be more consultation, more involvement in decision-making processes. So there's a whole bunch of different aspects to it. But yeah, it definitely stands to have a lot of cultural impacts as well. And there are people who are concerned about not only the night sky, but like what are we doing in space, and should we be engaging with it in that way? Is that a proper way to treat the space environment? You have discussions on, well, is space part of the human environment or not? And you can have people have very diverse perspectives on that. And then that has legal implications as well, because if you say that orbital environment is not part of the environment, then you don't have to subject your launches to doing environmental impact assessments first as far as how it impacts that particular environment. And so, yeah, there's a lot of implications on how you define things. And
I have seen or heard comments made about, astronomers have had a clear night sky basically for tens of thousands of years, really, and now it's just becoming polluted, and maybe they should just accept that, because that's what we do. We just basically move from one thing to the next, and we've had to deal with polluted waterways, we've had to deal with air pollution and all the other bits and pieces. So maybe astronomers now are just feeling the impact of human civilization. And that's almost said in a way that, well, that's just progress, really. But to me, it's a bit sad that we can't think about things before we destroy them.
Well, I think it's a problem because, one argument I've heard that every astronomer hears from time to time is, you put all your telescopes in space and that'll solve all the problems. And then, there you go. And I mean, there's several reasons why that's not practical, other than, it's expensive putting stuff in space, but like ground-based and space-based astronomy are complementary. There's different things that are strengths and weaknesses with both of them. And like, for example, James Webb, we're not going to be able to go out and fix it if something goes wrong. You do your astronomy on Earth, you need to sometimes calibrate your equipment depending on what you're doing, and you can fix things if they break. So you have that aspect from research astronomy. And then from looking at, space telescopes, they are also liable to be impacted by space debris. And they'll, if they're in low Earth orbit, they're still going to have all those streaks going through their field of view. They can get hit. There's been things coming out about, how Hubble, has streaks going through it, and, what is the impact of debris on Hubble images, and how will that get worse? So, and it's not like if you just put something in space, it'll be better. And I think there's a fundamental problem with the concept of you're cutting off the entire planet's access to be able to see a dark night sky anywhere. Like, when you have a light polluted city, you can go, away. It's hard to find in a way, but, you can go to a remote place and you'll have a darker sky, but the satellites will be visible everywhere. The impact of what we're doing in orbit will envelop, the entire planet. And it just, something seems wrong that we're completely making it so future generations will never be able to have that, ease of access to the cosmos in the same way. I mean, like when you look at the night sky, it's like you're connecting to the past, not only the sky itself, but, the associated traditions. And, you're just it's creating this more insular view where you're like not seeing out and being inspired by the universe. I think there's something ethically problematic about that.
Yeah, I think you're right. And for that reason, I really thank you for doing the research that you've done and bringing it to people's attention. And I no doubt this is just a beginning for you. I can see that you're someone that just loves getting into the nitty-gritty and researching the details and seeing how we can make our world a better place, which takes you right back to the beginning of our conversation about your first degrees and your first elements of study. And I think on that note, we might finish up. Other than to ask you a question, what do you think your future is? I should ask you, rather than me throwing it back onto you. Yeah. What's next for you?
I'm working on getting through my PhD. Trying to finalize some of my research, what exactly I want to be doing with different aspects of the research. I'm trying to get that all finalized because I'm doing something, I mean, it's very kind of interdisciplinary because you're looking at the science, but then there's also the policy, the ethics, and I really think there's value in all those perspectives. And so I'm trying to figure out which aspects are going to be, with one disciplinary focus and what's going to be more of the science and all of that type of thing. But I'm really interested in looking at, what can we learn from what we're doing around the Earth and looking ahead to the moon And, what are we going to do? There's a lot of things in progress for, putting satellites around the moon. And so, for example, radio astronomers have always said, we could put an observatory on the far side of the moon because it's a radio quiet zone and it would be great. But it won't really be any different than Earth at the rate we're going, unless something changes more proactively with that. And look, we've been all discussing this whole time about optical astronomy, but radio astronomy stands to be very impacted by the satellites as well. So just different parts of the spectrum are impacted differently. And so, I'm interested in looking at aspects of how we engage with the environment around the moon and on the lunar surface, and kind of the intersection of science activities and policy, and how those can all work together or not.
Well, I think you raise a really good point. There's no one way of dealing with this. And actually, I think the biggest challenge that we have is that most of the time things go wrong because groups aren't, as you mentioned before, consulting. So whether it's with First Nations people, or whether it's policymakers or ecologists or space scientists, etc., we don't have broad enough conversations to know how things are going to impact each element, or what best policies are to be put into place. So it's not a quick solution, but I think with research, conversation, policy, and just general community awareness, I think as much as that's pretty much the Australasian Dark Sky Alliance's philosophy, is that we just need to talk about this, bring it to people's awareness, and bright minds will come up with solutions. But until we know there's a problem and we're not talking about it, nothing's going to change, basically. So, yes, big topics of conversation. But on that note, Jessica, I will thank you very much. But one other question I have for you is, where can people learn more about you? Have you got a LinkedIn page or anything like that people could read more?
Yeah, I'm not on social media. So
it's probably why you get so much done. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. At some point in time, I'll get a website together, I guess. But yeah, I'm just kind of in the earlier stages of, getting research published and stuff. And so, I guess I don't have a particular recommendation other than just Googling my name and keywords relating to satellites and cultural astronomy, and then you can see what I'm up to.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. We'll do that for sure. Thanks, Jessica.
Thanks.